You're listening to
DNA ID.
brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime,
Zodiac Speaking.
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
all of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This episode concerns the violent death of a child. Listener discretion is advised. It was 1994. The Tulare County, California Sheriff's Office got a phone call at 12:40 p.m. on Thursday, March 3rd. A 10-year-old girl had gone missing from the Visalia sales yard at the corner of Road 152 and Mineral King Avenue east of the Visalia city limits. Angelica Ramirez had last been seen at 9:30 a.m. When Angelica's mother realized that she hadn't seen her daughter in quite some time, she looked for her, checking the bathrooms and food and toy vendors that might have attracted the 10-year-old, but she was nowhere to be seen. Angelica's mom, who is also named Angelica Ramirez, began to be very afraid. She asked everyone to look for her daughter, sending people walking the aisles between the rows upon rows of booths, calling for the girl. Eventually, Angelica arranged for the swap meet to broadcast the missing girl's name over the loudspeaker and tell her to report to the office. She never came. After some time, as you heard, Angelica and the swap meet powers that be decided to call the police. Angelica, who was of course distraught, told Tulare County deputies the following. Angelica, the child, had stayed home from school because her mom needed her to watch her 3 younger siblings while her mom and stepdad sold produce at their stand at the swap meet. Just to explain, a swap meet is a large outdoor market often set in a fairgrounds or parking lot type setting, with vendors of all varieties selling handmade goods, collectibles, food, and so on. They are generally frequented by people seeking bargains on food, house and giftware, clothing, and so on. Angelica Ramirez and her husband Francisco Tafoya's booth sold fruits and vegetables. It was their first time being a vendor at this particular swap meet in Visalia, but they were experienced vendors, selling their fresh, wholesome wares at other such markets throughout King, Fresno, and Tulare counties. I was told that the predominant demographic at the swap meets in the Central Valley region at the time were Hispanic, often migrant workers and their families. Because her parents were very busy with their booth, Angelica had been tasked with watching her younger brother and 2 sisters, including younger sister Michaela and 1-year-old brother Javier, who was in a stroller. But around 9:40 a.m., Angelica had an argument with her mother after her mother chided her for her treatment of their siblings. Angelica said she needed to go to the bathroom and no one else needed to go, so she walked off to the restroom area and never came back. Angelica, the mom, said it was a normal parent-child spat, nothing that would lead Angelica to run away and not return. Angelica's mom was hysterical and after a time was sent home as police needed to get to work and she was not able to contribute any additional information. Tulare County deputies searched the immediate area of the swap meet, looking into each booth and building, confident that the young girl would turn up. Sheriff Mike Boudreau of Tulare County, who was a very young deputy at the time and was dispatched to the scene, told me that at first everyone assumed they would find her. Abduction was far from their minds. Those really didn't commonly happen. A witness was located who believed that she'd seen the child alone by the bathrooms. The bathroom, a glorified shed housing separate men's and women's restrooms, was just across from Angelica's parents' booth. It should have been safe for her to go alone. She'd done it before, and she was practically within eyesight of her mother. But she wasn't there. She wasn't at any of the other booths. She wasn't anywhere. She had vanished. After hours of searching, Angelica was the subject of a missing person alert as her disappearance occurred in the days before public Amber Alerts. Bolos went out all over the state to alert law enforcement to Angelica's missing status. They described her as 4 feet tall, about 70 pounds, with brown eyes and long, waist-length black hair worn in a ponytail. She was last seen wearing a white blouse with pastel colors, a palm tree decal, and the word KAT on it. A maroon skirt with a black waistband, black Mary Janes with a small heel, and white socks. Her accessories included a red hair tie, white dangly earrings featuring Mrs. Potts from Disney's Beauty and the Beast, and a black and purple braided necklace with a cross on it. Police plunged into the missing child investigation with methodical optimism. A plane was flown over the area to see if Angelica had walked off. Deputies like Deputy Boudreau were dispatched to canvass the distant residences abutting the swap meet area, to search backyards and outbuildings, and to conduct traffic stops outside the swap meet to see if anyone had seen anything. Boudreau told me he personally went to 60 homes. Other deputies were assigned to start interviewing people who were there that day. Unfortunately, estimates were that there were over 1,000 people in and out of the swap meet on that busy Thursday. It would be impossible to talk to them all. The sheriff's office arranged for the provision of a scent dog at the scene, by far the most efficient way to quickly detect where the little girl had gone. The canine was given Angelica's bed sheet to sniff and then followed her scent west, from her parents' produce stand, out of the swap meet area, and across the Toon Lane Road to the parking lot. Little heeled shoe prints in the compacted dirt surface of the parking lot mirrored the trail, and then stopped 200 yards away from her mom's booth. Larger footprints from someone wearing shoes consistent with men's footwear were right beside the little girl's, and then they ended right there in the parking lot. Very distinct tire tracks there showed the little girl wearing the heeled shoes had gotten into a vehicle. Then Deputy Boudreau has said that at this time, he panicked. Angelica could be anywhere by now. Investigators searched the entire area around the swap meet, spanning out for a mile in each direction. They also posted and handed out flyers throughout the South Valley region and made use of local news media to disseminate Angelica's photo and word of the missing juvenile. The search went on for 48 hours, and every hour, the outlook got grimmer. On March 4th, the day after Angelica went missing, a spokesman for the Tulare County Sheriff's Department told the Hanford Sentinel, quote, "We are not ruling out foul play. In fact, that's the area we're working in. 10-year-olds don't just disappear in a crowd of several hundred or 1,000 people for this long." One unnamed Tulare detective told ABC 30 News in a video clip, quote, "We don't have any idea where she is. We don't have any solid leads as to where she went." In the same news segment, Angelica's mom was interviewed, barely able to speak for crying, saying, "I didn't see anything. She went to the bathroom and she didn't come back. Please, I need your help." Angelica's family reported that there was no one at the swap meet whom Angelica knew, whom she would have left with. Angelica, the mom, also said that her daughter had brought along some of her own arts and crafts to sell. Police wondered if someone approached the young girl and lured her away with the promise of money. For these reasons, the case was very quickly theorized to be a stranger abduction. And even though Angelica remained missing, police were confident they would find her quickly. This was because a witness saw a crying little girl, who might have been Angelica, getting into a vehicle with a Hispanic couple and driving away from the swap meet. They were driving a blue metallic Suzuki Samurai or Isuzu Trooper with a white convertible top and black interior. The vehicle was very noticeable because it had a sign that said "For sale, $2,200" sitting in the windshield, and a giant decal that said "No Fear." They were seen by 2 customers at the Visalia sales yard. After a request for information was issued about this couple and car, other people who had been at or in the area of the swap meet called in and reported having seen the same vehicle speeding away from the area and swerving in and out of traffic in a reckless manner. A girl was in the back seat and was screaming. A police sketch artist worked with witnesses to put together composite drawings of the couple, which were distributed statewide and posted all over the swap meet site. The man was in his late 20s with long black hair worn in a ponytail and a dark mustache. He was wearing a white tank top and a black baseball hat. The woman was younger, maybe 18 to 23, with long brown hair and big bangs. She was wearing dark lipstick, dark sunglasses, and a white shirt. Detectives were determined to find this couple and learned from Visalia sales yard vendors that they had seen the couple at the swap meet in the past. So the investigators reached out to other swap meets in Tulare, Kings, Kern, and Fresno counties as well, looking for this man and woman. One Tulare Sheriff's Office sergeant told the Tulare Advance Register, quote, "They've been out to the yard before, but we don't know where they're from, so we're checking areas they could have driven from." Police were all in on trying to track down this couple, and were still in the process of locating and interviewing people who had attended the swap meet that day when there was news. On Saturday, March 5th, around 7 a.m., the body of a little girl was found by a farm irrigation worker in a drainage ditch. The shallow canal was on Avenue 96, 1 mile west of Road 96, southwest of the town of Pixley. The man-made canal ran along the remote roadway through flat farm fields. The body floated face down in a vertical cement culvert in about 2 feet of water. She was still wearing her shirt but was nude from the waist down. A piece of fabric was tied tightly around her neck. Of course, she had no identification on her, but everyone knew that it was Angelica. Sure enough, the little girl in the drainage ditch was identified as Angelica. Her autopsy determined that she had died from ligature strangulation. She bore no signs of having been beaten or physically abused, but there were indications of sexual molestation, as the public was told. In reality, the pathologist had detected a small amount of sperm in Angelica's vaginal swabs. The little girl had been raped, and the offender had left a sample ripe for early-stage DNA testing. The ligature was a brightly colored baby's teddy bear-themed crib sheet or blanket, something that did not belong to Angelica. Investigators inventorying Angelica's clothing, which was her own, noted that her Mrs. Potts earrings were not found and have never been found. Let's talk about who little 10-year-old Angelica was. Victoria Angelica Ramirez, who went by her middle name, was being raised by her mother, Angelica Ramirez, and her husband, Francisco Tafoya. Francisco worked as a crop picker on area farms, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure how much he was around. Angelica, the mother, was described as a single mom in later articles. The family had moved to Hanford from Lemoore, just 15 miles away, a few months earlier. Angelica had attended Lakeside School for 8 months, where she was known as an avid reader and track enthusiast. A teacher remembered her as being quiet and keeping to herself, although she was friendly with a couple of other girls in her class and was very nice to everyone. She was described as intelligent and loving in newspaper accounts. From her photos and what we know about her outfit that day, Angelica seems like a normal little girl who liked Disney movies and princess hair and high heels and sparkly things. When Angelica was found deceased, children at her school were offered grief counseling. According to contemporary reporting, many of the students questioned why this unfathomable tragedy had happened and whether the police were going to catch her killer. Her classmates decided to plant a rose bush on the grounds of the school in Angelica's honor. The school also created a funeral fund for people to donate to Angelica's burial expenses, collecting $3,000 for a headstone and burial plot. Her funeral at the Immaculate Heart of Mary Catholic Church was attended by several hundred people, including many of the investigators on her case. Her mother wept through the entire service. The 45-minute mass was given in Spanish by Father Dan. The simple casket was carried in covered with a silver cloth, and, per the Hanford Sentinel, quote, an orderly procession of vehicles, nearly 3/4 of a mile long, moved the short distance from the church to the Hanford Cemetery, where Angelica Ramirez wept on her husband's shoulder as her daughter and namesake was buried, end quote. Pink carnations were laid upon the casket by the pallbearers, and scores of people lined up to approach the altar, genuflect, and touch the casket in farewell. At the later rosebush planting ceremony, Angelica's 10-year-old classmates read an essay they had written to accompany the rose planting ceremony at rural 260-student Lakeside School. We honor Angelica because she was our friend. She showed respect to us. We won't worry much because you are in a better and safer place. Let's go back to the place where Angelica's little body was found outside Pixley. Tulare County Sheriff's Crime Lab Detective Jeff Hutchins and Patrol Deputy Joe Bailey measured the cement culvert and its surroundings and used those little yellow plastic evidence triangles to denote tire tracks and footprints. Unfortunately, none of these were deemed very helpful, as the irrigation worker who found Angelica had parked in the turnout near the culvert where she floated and had obscured any helpful prints. The dump site was located 45 miles from where Angelica was abducted. I asked Sheriff Boudreau if this secondary crime scene shifted the focus of the investigation to the Pixley area rather than the abduction site in Visalia, and he said they remained equally focused on both. Since the nexus between the killer and either location was unknown, it would be ill-advised to prioritize one over the other. Still, it seemed to me likely that the killer was at least familiar with the spot where he left Angelica, just because it was somewhat remote. Of course, the farming operators and workers around the dump site were interviewed, their records run, investigated, and cleared, or add to a growing list of persons of interest. Now that Angelica had been found, the investigation shifted from a missing persons case to a full-scale homicide investigation. This from the Visalia Times-Delta, quote, "Her disappearance and death so gripped Tulare County at the time that then Sheriff Melvin Butch Coley took extra officers from his patrol and juvenile divisions to investigate the case," end quote. Tulare County Sheriff Sergeant Darrell Mackey said at least 10 detectives from his agency's homicide and juvenile divisions were staffing the case full-time. Sheriff Coley told the public, "We won't be content until we make an arrest." Investigators methodically analyzed everyone in Angelica's circle, immediate and extended family, family friends, acquaintances, and so on. They eliminated uncles, family friends, neighbors. Francisco Tafoya, her stepfather, was not considered a suspect because he had been at the booth with his wife all day, but his friends and extended family were all considered, because it was felt likely that Angelica would willingly leave with someone she felt comfortable with. Police had not at all ruled out a stranger abduction, but at 10 years old, Angelica was too smart to just leave with a total stranger, it was felt. And no one had seen a little girl being carried kicking and screaming, well, except for those reports about a crying girl. Remember the initial lead the police had about the couple driving the distinct Isuzu away from the swap meet with a little girl with them who was screaming. Police tracked down 10 people driving vehicles like the one described and interviewed them with no luck. But on March 9th, police got a call from a construction worker who was looking at an Isuzu fitting the description of the one he'd seen on the news. Police arrived and impounded it and found a gun under the driver's seat. Well, a weapon would explain how someone might have gotten Angelica quietly into the car. They arrested the driver for an illegal weapon in order to hold him while they investigated further. The adult brother and sister that the Isuzu belonged to, and the woman's little daughter, whom the witness had mistaken for Angelica, admitted that they were at the swap meet that day, shopping and browsing like all the other patrons. When they left, the male driver was amusing the little girl by weaving in and out of traffic, and she was screaming and laughing with terror. Although this behavior was ill-advised, there was nothing suspicious about this group. After police vetted them and took a look at the little daughter, the adults were cleared and their names were not released. Lieutenant Ray Lovelady told the Fresno Bee, quote, "We spent a lot of time looking for that couple. It was about 2 to 3 days. We were really disappointed when we found out they weren't involved. It put us back to square one." A bunch of time was devoted to varying reports about a man or men loitering outside the high-traffic bathroom shed. On the day of the swap meet, some people reported to the deputies on the scene that there was a suspicious guy who was hanging around the restroom area. Other people called in and said, "I saw a guy there, he seemed like he was waiting there," or "One dude looked like he was watching people come out of the bathroom," and so on. The investigators were able to identify and rule out one guy who was definitely loitering at the latrines. The others were chalked up to likely men waiting for their wives, daughters, mothers, or possibly the killer. Who knew? They also received tips galore from the public about friends, co-workers, acquaintances, neighbors, family members who gave them the ick and they thought could have done it. The investigators followed up on hundreds and hundreds of leads, but by March 24th, only 4 detectives were still devoted full-time to the case. There was no new solid information, according to Tulare County Sheriff's Lieutenant Dale Doty at the time, and they were now proceeding on the assumption that Angelica was the victim of a stranger abduction. By April 23rd, investigators had announced a $4,000 reward for information about the identity of the person who abducted and murdered Angelica Ramirez. Sheriff's Lieutenant Ray Lovelady told the Hanford Sentinel, quote, "We know that someone saw something." It was impossible to fathom that no one had noticed the little girl leaving the swap meet with a man. But the sight of a man and a girl walking together to the parking lot could have seemed innocuous, quotidian, unremarkable. In August 1994, the Hanford Sentinel ran a photo of Tulare County Violent Crimes Detective Jess Gutierrez, handing out a flyer about Angelica to vendors at the swap meet. But the article reported that investigators were no closer to solving her case after 5 months of investigating. Detective Gutierrez told the Sentinel that Angelica's was the primary case they were working on. They continually looked into all other cases they could find that had similarities to hers, although, admittedly, there weren't very many. Tulare had not had a child abduction since the 1970s. Gutierrez told the Sentinel they had expanded beyond the immediate crime scene areas, with the article reporting, quote, "Recently, a suspect in an abduction in Stockton was looked at to see if he might have been in Visalia when Angelica was taken, but this lead did not pan out," end quote. The Stockton abduction was a shocking crime against a child, reminiscent of the horrific 1993 kidnapping, rape, and murder of Polly Klaas, still very fresh in everyone's minds. If you haven't read the book In Light of All Darkness about that case, I highly recommend it. In this new case, 12-year-old Katie Romanek was taken from her family's kitchen in broad daylight by a heavily tattooed stranger wielding a large knife. The man tied up Katie's 16-year-old sister and her friend before absconding with Katie and the family car. For 22 hours, police scrambled, all hands on deck, to find Katie, while her parents flew home from vacation in a panic. The day after the abduction, the suspect apparently crashed the family car in a field, set it on fire, and let Katie go. She was found walking naked across a field in Lodi, terrified but alive. Stephen Reese Cochran, the offender, did not resist arrest and apparently had told Katie, "I'm sorry," even as he held her captive. He was on parole after spending 8 of the past 9 years in prison in Arizona for burglary convictions and lived with his mother in a trailer a half-mile from Katie's home. Cochran, who had no record of sex crimes, got 106 years in prison for this one. As you heard, Tulare investigators considered Cochran a possibility in their own case, given the brazenness and the nature of the victim. But Angelica's abduction took place 200 miles from Lodi, and Cochran could not be placed in Tulare County in March of 1994. Moving on, Tulare authorities flip-flopped about whether Angelica's was a stranger abduction. They were not ruling out that Angelica knew the person who took her. Detective Sergeant John Zapolak of the Tulare County Sheriff's Department told the Hanford Sentinel, quote, "Normally you would think that if somebody were taken away, it would be kicking and screaming. That's not the case here," end quote. It seems to me, though, that police were underestimating the ability of a child predator to lure a kid away peacefully. The famous lures involving a puppy, candy, "I'll take you to your mom," whatever. Angelica was kind of mad at her mom and maybe felt underappreciated. A wily predator would know just how to appeal to her mood. And indeed, investigators certainly didn't rule anything out. Detective Zapolak said they got many, many tips from the public. People would call in and say, "My neighbor goes to the flea market all the time, and he's pretty weird. Maybe you should check him out." Zapolak also told the Sentinel in this August article, quote, "We're still trying to work up some evidence involving DNA. If that works out, we may have something." It was 1994, after all. The use of DNA was becoming commonplace. And they had collected DNA from Angelica's rape kit that they knew was from her offender. But they also relied on traditional investigative methods, including having a special agent with the State Attorney General's office, Michael Prodan, develop a profile of Angelica's killer. I don't have a copy of it, but I was told that it posited that Angelica's abductor was middle-aged and charismatic. He had possibly seemed like an authority figure and likely smooth-talked the child and convinced her it was safe to go with him. A year after Angelica's murder, her mother told the Fresno Bee that she still struggled daily to make sense of what happened. She said, "I still remember how I felt when I couldn't find her that day. I was fearful and panicking. I thought the world would come to an end. It was the most horrible feeling a parent can experience." The Hanford Sentinel reported that after a year, quote, "There's a lot of things moving, but no positive hits yet." That, according to Sergeant John Zapolak. "We are still going through the list of known offenders that we're checking. We're still going through our forensic evidence. There's a lot of sex offenders that move around the state a lot, and it's a process of elimination. We'll keep working it till it's solved. It's not forgotten," he said. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, California had 9,691 registered sex offenders in 1994. That's a lot of people who had to be considered. In fact, DNA samples were collected from scores of sex offenders for comparison to the DNA and evidence, but there was never a match. Lieutenant Roy Lovelady told the Fresno Bee that even though the number of investigators working the case had been trimmed down to 3, they still pursued every tip and lead and had traveled throughout the state of California investigating similar crimes. He said, "We've accumulated 7 volumes of data about this case. We're not forgetting. We never forget a murder." Well, they would soon get a very unwelcome reminder. In March 1995, it happened again. On March 27th, 8-year-old Maria Johanna Pacino was abducted from Lemoore, California. The little girl, described by her mother as a little grown-up, had walked 2 blocks to a nearby Food King grocery store to buy a can of Bonnie Hubbard tuna fish. Her mother and her little sister and brother left 20 minutes later, planning to meet her at the store. When they arrived, there was no sign of Maria. Police learned that she made it to the store, where a clerk remembered her and receipts showed the tuna was purchased with cash at 3:18 p.m. A witness, Eric Douglas, saw the little girl at the store. She did not make it home. Her mother called the police at 4:10. Deputies from 3 sheriff's departments and FBI agents from the agency's Rapid Start team descended on the area to search for Maria. This was a massive investigation, up and running 24/7, with officers taking 12-hour shifts and relinquishing days off. The Find Maria task force swelled to 200 for a time, as investigators frantically followed up on every lead and tip. One lead they pursued was looking into Maria's father, Jose Pacino. He was a known drug trafficker whose whereabouts at the time were unknown, and police thought he might have abducted his daughter. But it turned out that when she was taken, he was in jail in Nevada on drug trafficking charges. Police considered whether his drug connections could have targeted Maria, or he could have ferried her across the border to live with his parents in Mexico. Those leads quickly led nowhere. A billboard with Maria's face on it sprang up in Lemoore, and the town of 15,000 where Maria lived came out in strong support of the family, wrapping trees, signs, and posts in pink ribbons symbolizing hope that Maria would return home safely. It was not to be. On Sunday, April 10th, 3 teenagers were rafting in the rapids of Poso Creek, 20 miles north of Bakersfield, near Highway 99 and Highway 46. Caught up in some brush on the side of the creek was the body of a little girl, identified as 4 foot 5 inches tall, 65-pound Maria. She was found 60 miles from where she was taken. Maria was fully clothed, but for one missing shoe, her clothing torn by the brush she was caught up in. Department of Justice officials quickly cautioned the Tulare, Kings, and Kern County authorities to treat the 2 child abduction and murder cases, Maria's and Angelica's, separately. But the similarities in the 2 cases did not elude police. Both girls were Hispanic eldest children of single mothers. By now, Angelica was single, abducted by a suspected stranger, and discarded in shallow water, miles from where they were taken, 1 year apart to the month. Both elementary school girls were petite, with black hair to their waists and wearing girly outfits. They were both abducted in public, in daylight, by a suspected stranger and discarded just 45 miles from each other. It was spooky. As Tulare County Sheriff Bill Whitman said, "It's frightening to think someone's killing our children. We never stopped working on Angelica Ramirez's case, and now we are literally trying to pick everyone's brains." Mike Boudreau, who is now the Tulare County Sheriff, said everyone assumed the cases were connected because they were so similar. In fact, Angelica's murder was the reason police jumped in with both feet so quickly when Maria went missing. Time after time, police said they could not rule out a connection or the possibility of a child serial killer operating in the area. During the search for Maria, the Kings County and Lemoore investigators reached out to Tulare authorities, hoping to seize on any leads or strategies. And the Tulare County Sheriff's Office even sent a homicide detective to Maria's autopsy. The initial autopsy failed to determine a cause of death, as Maria didn't have any evident trauma to her body. But a second autopsy determined she had died from asphyxiation as a result of manual suffocation. Unlike in Angelica's case, there was no evidence that Maria had been sexually assaulted. Nonetheless, investigators immediately started cross-checking lists of sex offenders, as well as witnesses, and so on, to see if there were any names in common in the 2 investigations. Unfortunately, there were not. Police searched far and wide for a suspect. America's Most Wanted even covered Maria's case. During the agonizing period when Maria was still missing, Angelica Ramirez's mother, Angelica, visited Maria's mother, Arcelia Farrell, at her home. She told the Tulare Advance-Sentinel, quote, "I'm here because I know what Maria's mother is going through. I want to tell her it happened to me and I know how badly it hurts." The Ramirez family was living in Hanford when Angelica disappeared, but moved to Lemoore soon after because of fear for the safety of their other children, end quote. Did you get that? Angelica's family moved to Lemoore to be in a safer environment, living in a mobile home park a mile from Maria Pacino, and then Maria was snatched off the street in broad daylight. When Maria remained missing, her mom told the Hanford Sentinel, quote, "Sometimes Mrs. Ramirez comes over crying about her daughter, and I know what she's going through," end quote. Angelica definitely considered the cases connected, telling the Fresno Bee, quote, "My daughter and Maria look remarkably alike. This is the work of an animal, a maniac. I harbor a lot of anger toward the people that killed my daughter. They may be making fun of police now, but they will never be able to make fun of God, and he knows who was committing this. These crimes, they will be caught and justice will be served. I just hope they are caught before another innocent victim dies," end quote. Because the Ramirezes now lived in Lemoore and were suffering from the loss of Angelica in an unsolved homicide, the community rallied around both families, holding fundraisers like an enchilada luncheon to raise money for a reward for info in either case. Their goal was to reach $10,000 by raising money to supplement the $4,000 already being offered by the Tulare County Sheriff's Secret Witness Program. Their efforts were aided by a $1,000 donation made by inmates at the Pleasant Valley State Prison, who were apparently just as horrified as everyone else that two little local girls had been slain in rapid succession. By the third week in April, the reward was more than $10,000. Maria's mother also received a lot of donations for her daughter's funeral. She had so much left over that she made donations to the Adam Walsh and Public Class Foundations, among others. And then a suspect emerged. A witness had seen a man in the area of the grocery store around the time of Maria's abduction. I'm not sure how police eventually identified him. Reports cited an anonymous tip. But on April 18th, they had an investigator staffed on the suspect's naval ship, the USS Abraham Lincoln, stationed off the coast of Japan, interview a 15-year structural engineer mechanic named Gene Estel McCurdy. The 35-year-old was a petty officer who since September 1994 had been stationed at the Naval Air Station in Lemoore. They learned that McCurdy had shipped out on the USS Abraham Lincoln 2 days after Maria's body was found. During the initial interview, he acted very suspicious, crying, shifting in his seat, and asking if Maria had been molested. In his footlocker were found porn magazines featuring teenagers, staged to appear as adolescents with pigtails and stuffed animals, as well as photos of young girls. On April 30th, Lieutenant Mark Bingaman of the Kings County Sheriff's Office, Agent Mike Devine of the Naval Investigative Service, Deputy Marshal Bruce Ackerman, and a Lemoore police officer flew from California to McCurdy's ship to question him. He could not answer their questions about what he did on the day of Maria's abduction after renting some adult movies, or why he had reserved a motel room that night, to their satisfaction. McCurdy was charged with Maria's murder with special circumstances of kidnap, rape, sodomy, and performing lewd and lascivious acts during a murder. And the Tulare County investigators were eyeing him very hard, too. In fact, he was called the prime suspect in Angelica Ramirez's murder. This was because, according to Mark Bingaman's book about the case, McCurdy brought up Angelica's name when they were interviewing him about Maria. And it wasn't much of a leap that he could have killed both girls. The cases were deemed too similar to be unrelated, and Lemoore and Visalia were less than 30 miles apart. McCurdy had ties to the area, having grown up in Bakersfield. Tulare Sheriff's Lieutenant Ray Lovelady commented, quote, "Some information has come to light that he was in our area in March 1994. Further, in his interview, McCurdy was very vague and obfuscatory, but did not really refute that he had also killed Angelica, saying he needed to unlock the memories with hypnosis, and it hurt too much to talk about. He even wrote an apology letter saying, "Dear Mrs. Ramirez, I am so sorry for the loss of your daughter. When I deal with this, I remember, maybe." This seemed promising, and generally the hope was that since McCurdy was good for Maria, he was good for Angelica as well. Well, not so fast. In the end, investigators could not place McCurdy in Visalia on March 3, 1994. To the contrary, naval records showed that he was stationed at Whidbey Island Naval Air Station in Washington State at the time, and he was documented as being on the base that day, not on leave. And although he made opaque references to Angelica, he could not relate any details regarding her murder whatsoever. But even more concrete than McCurdy's alibi was the DNA evidence. Remember, I said that sperm had been detected in the autopsy swab taken from Angelica's body. A DNA profile was obtained from the sample, and a blood sample was obtained from McCurdy. Rod Andrus, a forensic scientist from the California Department of Justice, compared the two and found them inconsistent. The DNA evidence eliminated Jean McCurdy as a suspect in Angelica's murder. Angelica's mother sat through the news conference announcing that Maria's case had reached a resolution. The silence on Angelica's case was deafening. Until, once McCurdy was cleared in Angelica's case, police made it a point to address this fact publicly in a press conference. They were extremely concerned that everyone would assume Angelica's case had been solved because Maria's was. Tulare County Sheriff Bill Whitman announced that lab tests had 100% exonerated McCurdy in Angelica's case and said, quote, "The suspect in Lemoore is not the same person who committed the crime against our victim. We called this press conference because we're afraid there is a false sense of security in our community because people thought the killer was in jail. The killer is still out there. We are at a dead end as far as having a suspect. We need help from the public. We desperately want to arrest this person. If Tulare County had a most wanted list, this person would be at the top of the list. That's how bad we want him." End quote. Sheriff's Captain Larry McLaughlin said, quote, "We must refocus the public on this case. We feel somebody saw something, and they haven't come forward because they believe McCurdy is the one responsible." Under Sheriff Jerry Barker added, quote, "We plan to direct our resources at investigative leads, and he's not an investigative lead at this time." Lieutenant Ray Lovelady said investigators believed that Angelica's killer was a classic pedophile who would kill again until he was caught. Quote, "We know we've got to catch the guy before he does it again." And this from the Hanford Sentinel, quote, "Angelica Ramirez, eyes wet with tears, stared at the floor throughout most of the 30-minute press conference, clutching the hand of one of the volunteers from the League of Mexican-American Women," end quote. But she did find the strength to speak, saying she had prayed to her murdered daughter to please from the heavens help find her killer. She warned the public that this tragedy could happen to anyone and to plead for the public to call in any information. At the end of the press conference, Sheriff Whitman announced the $10,000 reward for the arrest and conviction of Angelica's killer and the establishment of a toll-free telephone number staffed 24 hours a day to handle tips from the public. Jean McCurdy pleaded not guilty and testified at his trial that he had been at the Food King Plaza renting adult movies at the same time that Maria was there. He denied killing her, but a witness who happened to be named Michael Jackson testified that he saw a man who he thought was McCurdy holding Maria's hand in the shopping center parking lot and then putting her into his pickup truck. McCurdy had also shaved off his mustache during the last week of March when Maria was still missing. Furthermore, McCurdy's sister testified that he molested her repeatedly when they were children and that he was familiar with the creek where Maria was found because they grew up in nearby Bakersfield. A shower curtain resembling one McCurdy owned was found partially buried approximately 500 yards upstream from Maria's body. And finally, in excruciatingly sad testimony, McCurdy's next-door neighbor in his apartment building testified that on the day Maria disappeared, she could hear a child's whimpering and sobbing coming through the wall she shared with Bachelor McCurdy's apartment. She didn't recognize what it was at the time and only later learned that a child had gone missing that day and her neighbor was possibly abusing her next door. McCurdy's defense shamefully used Angelica's unsolved case to try to sow reasonable doubt at his trial. The defense attorney told the jury all about all the similarities between Angelica's and Maria's cases, but then showed them DNA testing results that exonerated McCurdy in Angelica's murder. Because of the similarities in the crimes, the same killer must have struck in both cases. Ergo, McCurdy did not kill Maria. The defense attorney told the jury, quote, "It is not inconceivable that one day the murder of Angelica Ramirez will be solved, and it may turn out that the killer was responsible for Maria too. I'm not saying I have any evidence or knowledge that's the case, but I want to bring that hypothetical to you, to introduce something to you, a phrase called lingering doubt or residual doubt," end quote. The assistant district attorney, the prosecutor, quickly refuted this, saying the defense was grasping at straws. The DNA had shown Angelica's case had nothing to do with Maria's, and McCurdy was guilty as sin. Sure enough, he was found guilty on January 31st, 1997. Special circumstances of kidnapping allowed the jury in the penalty phase to consider the death penalty. But meanwhile, behind the scenes, there was what seemed like an earth-shattering development in Angelica's case. A 28-year-old prisoner named Donald Eugene Bales had been convicted of sexually assaulting a 17-year-old boy. This was in January 1987. Bales asked to speak to investigators on Angelica's case, and when they were all sitting down, he voluntarily and spontaneously confessed to killing the girl. He claimed to have been at the Visalia swap meet on March 3, 1994. He saw Angelica and she was lost, looking for her parents. She was wearing a white shirt with an animal on it, he thought. He forced her into the car by grabbing her left arm. She screamed and said, "Let me go." He said no and then said it got out of control. He then drove her to a remote place and raped her as she struggled. He choked her to death and then dumped her in the canal and fled. Oh boy, well, more often than not, this is how cases get solved, right? Someone sees someone else being credited with his crime, decides to talk, and police follow up and close the case. But then Bales also confessed to killing Maria. Even though a guilty verdict had already been returned against McCurdy, Tulare County authorities informed Kings County authorities that they should take a look at Donald Bales. This temporarily halted the penalty phase of McCurdy's trial while it was all sorted out. Detective Mark Bingaman wrote in his book about Maria's case that he and other investigators from Kings County were not happy at all with this development. As far as they were concerned, McCurdy killed Maria, and by the way, a jury agreed and he had already been convicted. The more Tulare investigators talked to Bales, the more they grew skeptical. Bales said he strangled Angelica with a rope, and they knew that not to be true. Then he changed it to a plastic bag. They drove him to the area where Angelica had been found, and he couldn't identify it. The details he provided about the shirt Angelica was wearing and the swap meet were in the police bulletins issued to the public. Further, Bales was shown to have an IQ in the mid-70s, indicating possible intellectual disability. He also recanted his confession after all that. A blood sample was collected from Bales and tested. In a statement, Tulare County Undersheriff Jerry Baker said, quote, "We weren't able to link him to our case by any physical evidence. He is not a suspect in the Ramirez case," end quote. A DNA test had excluded him as Angelica's killer, and there was nothing whatsoever connecting him to Maria's murder. Bales' confession caused a delay in the penalty phase of McCurdy's trial because it had to be disclosed to the defense, which of course moved for a new trial to allow them to introduce evidence that Bales had, quote, confessed to killing Maria. Prosecutors showed all the reasons that Bales' confession was false, and the trial court decided against a new trial for McCurdy. He appealed, and the California Supreme Court ruled, quote, "Defendant contends the trial court abused its discretion in excluding Bales' statements as inadmissible hearsay. We agree with the court's finding that Bales' statements were unreliable. One of the more obvious indicators of their unreliability was the circumstance that Bales initially denied abducting Pacino, then confessed to doing so, and then almost immediately recanted." So Bales' statements incriminating himself were out. A 2014 California Supreme Court ruling also held, quote, "There were some similarities between Pacino's murder and Angelica R.'s, but defendant, at best, established that he did not kill Angelica R. Any possible similarities between the two crimes did not exonerate defendant of Pacino's death," end quote. The penalty phase of Gene McCurdy's trial resumed, and the jury convicted him of the first-degree murder, kidnapping, and kidnapping with the purpose to commit a lewd act on a child under 14 years old for his crimes against Maria Pacino. The jury found true the special circumstance allegation of kidnapping murder and sentenced him to death. Maria's mom had wanted the death penalty for the man she believed was guilty of and was now convicted of killing her child. Gene McCurdy was sent to death row, where he still resides today. Just before the following March 1996, which would see the second anniversary of Angelica's abduction and murder and the first anniversary of Maria's, it happened for a third time. 11-year-old Tracy Renee Conrad, who went by Renee, disappeared on February 25th while walking to her 11-year-old friend's house 2 blocks from her own home in North Hanford. Renee was missing for a month, and that month was excruciating for everyone. The sense of doom when Renee failed to turn up was palpable, and the specter of the other missing March girls was like a terrible omen. Police frantically yet methodically launched into high gear once again, searching everywhere they could think of and delving into the Conrad family. I'm not going to get into the details of the massive search for Renee, which involved 850 leads, door-to-door searches, bloodhounds, search and rescue helicopters, and 250 correctional officers grid-walking the fields surrounding the town. Even police described her disappearance with empty-handed gestures and the word poof. Police were immediately inundated with inquiries about any connection to Maria's and Angelica's cases. It was illogical, of course. There was a suspect in Maria's case who could not have killed Renee because he was in jail awaiting trial and had been cleared in Angelica's case. But Angelica had lived in Renee's town, Hanford, when she was abducted, and community speculation was bordering on hysteria. Petite, dark-haired girls were being abducted and murdered with seeming regularity, and it was terrifying. Visalia Police Department Lieutenant Robert Williams stoked the fire by saying, quote, "This certainly seems to be a serial event." Visalia Police Chief Bruce McDermott appeared on a TV news broadcast and said, quote, "We don't know when the next abduction will be. The trend has been a child a year, and I'm concerned if we don't do something, another might occur. It could very well be the work of a serial killer." Even the seasoned FBI agent staffing Renee's case, Jim Beasley, was caught up in it. He told the Hanford Sentinel, quote, "It would be premature to say we see a link among the three cases, but it is not being ruled out." He later tempered these remarks, saying, "The things that look like common threads could be coincidence." During the time Renee was missing, the second anniversary of Angelica's unsolved murder came and went. Angelica, her mom, told the Sacramento Bee, quote, "How could this happen? Same time, same age every year. 2 years ago, my daughter. Last year, Maria. Now this. This is too much, too terrible," end quote. Angelica attended a vigil for Renee, but didn't want to approach the missing girl's parents because she didn't want to remind them of her own daughter's outcome. She told the Fresno Bee, quote, "I pray to God what happened to my daughter will not happen to Renee, and that she's found alive. I have already lived the horrors the Conrads are feeling, and this is something that cannot be described," end quote. Angelica and her children no longer lived in Hanford. They had moved to Lemoore, but Angelica still adorned her neighborhood with yellow ribbons in honor of Renee and handed out flyers in nearby towns. Many false alarms from a jittery public had police checking reports of bodies in waterways all over the region. But when Renee was found on March 21st, she was not in water. A family member at the home she had been walking to when she vanished, the Gaelics, called police and reported a foul smell in the backyard. 24-year-old resident Michael Gaelic had found what the police found when they arrived to investigate, a body stuffed into a 3 by 2.5 foot unused backyard ceramic kiln. It was Renee, fully clothed but bound, gagged, head wrapped in a white t-shirt, and suffocated to death. I'm going to state flat out here that this was a colossal screw-up on the part of the police. The Gaelic home, sporting yellow come-home-safe Renee ribbons, had been thoroughly searched, according to investigators looking for the 11-year-old. The Hanford police chief explained that the kiln had been covered by a brick-lined lid and was stacked with moldings used to make ceramics, along with tools and so on. But it was evident that police had simply failed to search the kiln, which was clearly big enough to hide the girl's body. Kevin Gaelic, the father of the 11 and 13-year-old boys Renee had been going to visit, who lived in a camper on his parents' property, was promptly arrested and charged with Renee's murder. This from the Hanford Sentinel, quote, "Additional criminal charges were added in May 1996 alleging that Gaelic kidnapped his niece in 1990 and bound and gagged her before molesting the then 18-year-old woman," end quote. Gaelic's niece said she'd been tied up, gagged, and wrapped in a sheet just the way Renee was. The 36-year-old Gaelic also had burglary and drug convictions, and a conviction for carrying a concealed weapon and for grand theft with a firearm. He was living on the property where his mother operated a daycare center. The finding of Renee absolutely shattered the town's residents. They had hoped against all reason that the pattern would be broken and Renee would be found alive. Angelica Ramirez told the Press-Democrat, quote, "I just feel so much pain for them. Her mother has the force of God with her. I know how badly she feels." Maria's mom, Arcelia Farrell, said, quote, "Now we have all lost our babies. You can never recover. 1,000 years may pass, but the pain is too great." Kevin Bailick was convicted and sentenced to life without parole, putting an end to Renee's case. He was considered as a person of interest and thoroughly investigated in Angelica's case, but was ruled out when DNA tests excluded him. He is still an inmate in California's Mule Creek State Prison and will be until the day he dies. So of the 3 child murders, only Angelica's saw no resolution. In the fall of 1996, Tulare County Sheriff Bill Whitman announced the establishment of the Angelica Ramirez Scholarship to pay tuition and expenses of Hispanic candidates in the Tulare Kings Police Academy. It was a nice gesture, of course, but it resolved nothing. By late 1997, investigators were on to a new suspect for a brief time. John Brewer Eustace had been arrested in North Carolina on March 27th for kidnapping, taking indecent liberties with a 2-year-old child, a first-degree sex offense, and first-degree burglary. Investigators from the Tulare County Sheriff's Department were interested in speaking with Eustace to see if there was any chance he was the man who had raped and slain Angelica Ramirez in March of 1994. This was standard operating procedure, investigating any child rapist who came across their desks, especially one who had abducted the child in a stranger abduction. Tulare Sheriff's detectives worked to place Eustace in California, but in the end said they had no reason to believe that he was the man responsible. They sought a blood sample, but a court order was required, which would mean a long and drawn-out process. I don't know if this was done or if they ruled Eustace out based on geographic or other factors. The years ticked by. 2001 saw the 7th anniversary of Angelica's murder. Her mother refused to let her child be forgotten. In March 2001, she donated a plaque engraved, quote, "In loving memory of our friend and classmate Angelica Ramirez," to Lakeside School, which she had attended. Angelica's sisters Connie, Michelle, and the baby, also named Victoria Angelica, visited the grave with newspaper reporters. Angelica said, "It's hard because they didn't find the people who did it, but they are still looking." The following year, 2002, saw updated DNA testing. DNA analysis had come a long way since 1994, and STR profiling was now the standard. A male STR DNA profile developed from the sperm fraction of the vaginal swabs collected from Angelica's autopsy were entered into the National DNA Database, as well as the California State DNA Database, established in 1990. The sample was searched in the database monthly for 2 decades, never getting a hit. This was a surprise to all. Child killers were deemed likely to reoffend, but this guy seemed not to have. Now Lieutenant Joe Torres, who became the lead investigator on the case in 2006, later told the Visalia Times-Delta, quote, "This case is something I hold dear to my heart. It was shocking to everyone." Torres said he was surprised that there had been no hits to the suspect DNA in the state or federal databases. He told ABC 30, quote, "The way he committed it was not the first time that he's done this. There's no way you're going to go from raping and murdering a 10-year-old to saying, 'I'm going to stop now,'" Torres said. On the 10th anniversary of Angelica's murder in March 2004, Sheriff Bill Whitman told the Visalia Times-Delta that since 1997, they had not had a viable suspect. "We've sat around and talked about that case time and time again. We would love to be able to solve it." Sheriff's Captain Robert Lomelli told the paper, quote, "The case never goes away. As we hear of similar types of cases, we talk to other agencies, we continue to follow leads. We have high hopes of solving it." Of course, the one ace in their sleeve was the DNA evidence, but with no hits in the state or national DNA databases, it was useful only for one-to-one elimination of suspects. And unfortunately, due to investigator turnover and time, the case had changed hands many times, and few to none of the original investigators were still with the Sheriff's Department at this time. Angelica's case received attention over the following decade, but nothing material developed. Lieutenant Joe Torres worked the case in the mid-2000s. He continued the hunt, arranging to have the DNA sample tested against suspects in similar crimes across the country and following up on tips that still trickled in. When Mike Boudreau, one of the rookie deputies who had worked Angelica's case in 1994, became Tulare undersheriff, he had a meeting with the then sheriff, asking for permission to staff an investigator on Angelica's case. The sheriff was sympathetic but declined the request. He felt that the case simply did not merit the expenditure of additional resources. It was cold as ice and was destined to remain unsolved. And it's easy to see why he felt this way. At the time, no one envisioned the advent of investigative genetic genealogy, by which the names of unknown suspects can be flushed out simply by examining their family trees. But Boudreau was one of the original investigators on the case. He actually witnessed Angelica's body floating in the canal when she was found. He told me that image never left him, and he was determined to see the case solved. He told me this decision not to pursue Angelica's case any further didn't sit right with him, and when he became sheriff in 2015, he vowed to make some changes. In 2016, new Tulare Sheriff Boudreau established a cold case homicide unit. It was staffed with investigators Christopher Dempsey and Dwayne Johnson, two seasoned investigators tasked with taking on the county's cold case homicides. They noted the availability of DNA evidence in the case and sent it off in an effort to conduct what they called familial DNA analysis. This was a familial DNA search in which close relatives of an unknown suspect can be identified in a state's offender DNA database by virtue of similar DNA markers. The familial search failed to turn up any close family members of the suspect, meaning that since the passage of the state's DNA collection law, none of his direct male relatives had been convicted of an offense that qualified for a DNA entry in the state database. In the spring of 2019, Sheriff Boudreaux assigned Detective Sergeant Joshua Lowry to the case. Lowry reviewed all the evidence and the case file from top to bottom. This was no small task. By this time, the case file was massive, with over 1,000 interviews and over 200 suspects having been eliminated, mostly by a big push in the 1990s to register violent sex offenders. This involved rounding up and obtaining blood samples from violent sex offenders living in the Central Valley region. Their DNA had been obtained from these blood samples, and none matched Angelica's killer. Sergeant Lowry told me that when he took up the case, there were no promising suspects to start with. On the 25th anniversary of Angelica's abduction in 2019, the TCSO released a video called "Help Catch My Killer," narrated by a little girl in Angelica's voice, talking about the swap meet that morning and going to the bathroom by herself. Video footage shows generic swap meet booths, the dark brown wooden bathroom shed, the drainage ditch, and photos of Angelica. She says, 2 days later, my body was found in the town of Pixley. I had been thrown into a ditch like a piece of trash. The man responsible for my death did some terrible things to me, and he needs to be caught so he can't do them to anyone else. I was only 10. My life was supposed to be just starting, not ending. It was startling and impactful to hear a child's voice say all this. But the Tulare Sheriff's Office was not content to cross their fingers that the video would achieve results. Behind the scenes, they embraced science and new technology. In March 2019, the investigators started working with Parabon Nanolabs on a phenotype image of the suspect. A SNP profile was generated from the sexual assault kit collected at Angelica's autopsy, and Sheriff Boudreaux presented Parabon's computer-generated image to the world on March 5th. Quote, "For the first time in 25 years since she was killed, we have a face to this crime," the sheriff announced. That face featured light brown or even fair skin, dark eyes, dark hair, and few to no freckles. He was of Hispanic origin, with an admixture from Central America and Southwest Europe, with lesser contributions from West Europe, Northwest Africa, and South America. They showed images of the suspect at ages 25, 50, and 75. Now, it wasn't a surprise that the suspect was likely Hispanic. As I mentioned earlier, the swap meet that Angelica had disappeared from was typically attended by Hispanics living in the Central Valley. Also, it seemed more likely that Angelica would feel comfortable with somebody who spoke Spanish and might be more inclined to leave with him peacefully. But it did allow the investigators to cross off their list any suspects who did not fit the description, now that they had scientific evidence and not just theories that he was indeed of Hispanic origin. So now the investigators focused on men on their POI list who fit the description provided by Parabon. But it was an exercise in futility because it would turn out that the suspect's name was nowhere in their case file. It was going to require investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, to determine who he was. The IgG analysis in this case was significantly hindered, delayed, by a substantial error that cost the Tulare investigators more than 2 years. It was very, very complicated, so I'm going to oversimplify the situation in an attempt to explain it. Prior to Sergeant Lowry taking up the case, the two prior cold case detectives had partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, contracting for the complete package of the phenotype and IgG. In 2018, a private lab selected by Parabon was sent a DNA sample from Angelica's rape kit for development of a SNP profile. The sample was a mixture, almost certainly, of Angelica's DNA and that of her rapist. The lab undertook microarray genotyping and purported to obtain a SNP profile from the suspect. The profile was provided to Parabon, who uploaded to GEDmatch, where only very distant relatives were located. C.C. Moore assessed the case as a very low probability solve using IgG, But she also noted that the match data she was seeing didn't really make sense. When the suspect's sample was uploaded to Family Tree DNA, it was a different story. In winter of 2020 or spring of 2021, they got a match of 2,925 centimorgans, a hit to the case of a suspected rapist being investigated by another agency. Sounds great, right? Well, it wasn't, because the DNA data was clearly off. I can't begin to explain how, but the DNA was such an exact match that it set off alarm bells. It wasn't a sibling match, but the same person. A review by Parabon discovered that the lab they had used had contaminated the sample. In short, the lab had one-way cross-contaminated the Tulare sample by mixing in the rapist sample from another agency. Both samples had been genotyped at the same time by the same lab. After becoming aware of the cross-contamination, Tulare County decided to proceed in a different direction. I'd like to explain here that the phenotype was not compromised, and that data proved to still be accurate once the uncontaminated sample was rerun. So by this time, it was June of 2021, Tulare County started working with the FBI, which selected Othram Labs to conduct a new SNP analysis on the 9 nanograms of DNA left on the vaginal swabs collected from Angelica. Once the SNP profile for the suspect was obtained, the Tulare County Sheriff's Office, in collaboration with the FBI's Forensic Genealogy Unit, began an IgG analysis anew. The FBI genealogist uploaded Angelica's suspect's DNA sample into GEDmatch and Family Tree and gave Sergeant Lowry access to the data. They had one good match, which I was told was in the first cousin or second cousin range. At a later press conference, Sergeant Lowry said, quote, "From that genetic match, we knew we were close, within 2 generations, of where the suspect would fall on the family tree," end quote. Sergeant Lowry and his team built out the suspect's tree to the grandparent level, so I believe the match was a first cousin or a first cousin once removed. The family tree building pointed the investigators to one family based in the Los Angeles area. The family had 5 male siblings who were the right ages to be Angelica's killer back in 1994, and in the correct location in the family tree to be consistent with the DNA data. These were 5 brothers from the Villegas family, originally from Mexico. Background research on the brothers pretty quickly pointed to one suspect in particular. One of the brothers had a record and also had connections to Tulare County in the 1990s. But they couldn't locate this brother, so they had to start with the ones they could find. The investigators didn't want to contact the men because there was a significant flight risk given the Villegas' close connections with Mexico. So, with the assistance of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Homicide Gang Task Force, Sergeant Lowry went to Southern California and in one day was able to procure surreptitious DNA samples from 2 of the brothers living there. Sergeant Lowry sent the samples to the California Department of Justice's DNA lab in San Francisco, which ran kinship tests and confirmed the suspect was a full sibling to the 2 samples collected. Sergeant Lowry was convinced that the brother he could not locate, Ramiro Villegas, the one who could be placed in Tulare in the 1990s, was his man. In April of 2022, the investigators traveled back to LA and contacted the remaining brothers and 2 sisters of Ramiro Villegas. Interviews with the siblings explained why they had not been able to locate Ramiro Villegas. He had passed away in Mexico. But the interviews also confirmed that Sergeant Lowry's suspicion was correct. Information he gathered from the family about their dead brother Ramiro told him all he needed to know. Voluntary DNA samples from the remaining 2 Villegas brothers confirmed they were full siblings to the suspect, the only remaining possible brother, Ramiro Villegas. On June 30th, 2022, a press conference was held announcing that Tulare County authorities had identified the man responsible for abducting, raping, and murdering Angelica Ramirez. Some of Angelica's siblings stood in the background, looking very sorrowful as they each clutched a bouquet of white roses. Sheriff Boudreau talked about the complexity and depth of the investigation, including the consumption of thousands of investigative hours, following up on thousands of leads, interviewing more than 200 suspects, and conducting nearly 1,000 interviews in total. "This case has gripped each of us," Boudreau said. "I remember that day because I also was assigned to search. I remember the desperate feeling we had trying to locate this young girl." Sheriff Boudreau announced, quote, "Based on the DNA sample taken at the scene, comparing it to those directly from his family members, as well as new information, placing him in Tulare County at the time of Angelica's disappearance and murder. The Tulare County Sheriff's Office was able to positively identify Ramiro Villegas as the man who kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered Angelica Ramirez on that horrible, horrific day of March of 1994. I spoke with the family just yesterday, and there was no other word but they felt justice had slipped. Because he died 10 years ago, we feel as if justice was not served, but I promised the family that we had never given up on this case. The Angelica Ramirez case has always been a top priority for me in this office. Solving her murder took longer than anyone ever wanted and, quite frankly, expected. With us identifying her murderer now known, I truly pray for closure and healing for the family. Angelica's killer is no longer a mystery. If there's any solace, we know that he is dead, and I think he has a special place in a certain place. But we do know that Angelica is in heaven, and we console with family to make sure they know that the essence of this child, the good Lord never forgets. Closure of this case would have been far more fitting with the arrest of the suspect. I'm happy to say, as your sheriff, we are announcing today the Angelica Ramirez case is now officially closed with the suspect identified. Not the ending we would all have hoped for, but an ending nonetheless. Unfortunately, we are not putting handcuffs on the suspect, but we are closing the case. We are positive that this is our suspect on the case. My sympathies go to the family, as I have sat with them in a room personally and felt the heartache that they feel. We pray the closure of this case does bring some type of healing, although Mama has really wanted to see him in prison, so that little bit aches and hurts. That all from Sheriff Boudreaux. Angelica's sister, Michaela, was the only family member who spoke. She said, "At least now we have a face to the killer. I don't have to worry about this person being out there doing this to someone else." The family had told the sheriff that for decades, they suffered from nightmares and paranoia that the suspect was near them, watching them, was someone they knew. Michaela felt guilt because she didn't walk with her sister to the bathroom that day at the swap meet. The sheriff told her none of this was anyone's fault except the child predator Villegas. And although it's disappointing that he is dead, at least Angelica's family can take comfort in his being gone forever. So what do we know about Ramiro Villegas? Not a heck of a lot. He was born in Mexico in May of 1949. This would have made him about 45 years old when he killed Angelica. He immigrated from Mexico to the U.S. in 1968 or 1969, moving from the L.A. area to Tulare County in 81 or 82. He was essentially a migrant field worker, picking crops throughout the region and working his way up to a managerial role. He lived in Tipton, less than 10 miles from Pixley, where Angelica was found. From there, he moved to Porterville and lived there until the mid to late 1990s, before moving back to Orange County. Interviews with Villegas' family and the girlfriend he had lived with at the time that Angelica was murdered revealed that Villegas often frequented flea markets, including those in Porterville, Tulare, and Visalia, the one from which he abducted Angelica. This next bit is all derived from reporting by the Hanford Sentinel. The first known law enforcement contact Villegas had that resulted in criminal charges was in January 1991. Villegas was arrested and charged with fighting in public in Delano. He was convicted and sentenced to 36 months probation. Then he was arrested in March 2001 in El Dorado County for transportation of controlled substances for sale. Unfortunately, records have been lost and there's no record of the disposition of this case, but it does not appear Villegas did any prison time. Next, Villegas was arrested in January 2002 in El Dorado County. This time, the charges were serious: transportation of controlled substances for sale, possession of controlled substances for sale, operating a drug house, possession of a firearm, and child endangerment. My ears perked up when I heard the child endangerment part. It turned out this was because of the close proximity of Villegas' drug sales house to a school. He was convicted of all these crimes in February 2002 and sentenced to 2 years in California State Prison. He was released in October 2004, turned over to Immigration and Naturalization Services, and deported immediately because he was in the U.S. illegally. Villegas died in Mexico in December of 2014. Like many field workers in the region, he had contracted valley fever, long-term infection caused by contaminants in the soil. As a result, he suffered from a long-term lung disease and died of complications from that infectious disease. So in trying to gather information about Villegas, The investigators were left with just interviews of the people who knew him, his family, and his girlfriend. And what they had to say was enlightening. Villegas' sisters told the Tulare investigators that Villegas had molested children in the extended family. Sergeant Lowry said at the press conference, quote, "The first two incidents occurred in the LA area pre-1981, but we don't have the exact time frame." He specified that one of the victims had been a child of just 6 to 7 years old and the other a child aged 8 to 9. None of these incidents had been reported. There was more. Sergeant Lowry interviewed the woman who had lived with Villegas in 1994, the year Angelica was killed. The sergeant told me that they learned from Villegas' girlfriend that Villegas had victimized her own daughter. We all know that child molesters tend to surround themselves with children. Villegas had operated a drug house near a school and was in a relationship with a woman with a young daughter. I was horrified to learn that this daughter was a juvenile, 14 years old, when she became pregnant with Villegas' baby. After that, the daughter and her mom, Villegas' girlfriend, cut him off from the daughter, although they did not report the rape and child sexual abuse. I don't know what happened to the baby, but shortly after the child sexual abuse survivor was removed from Villegas' clutches, that was when he killed Angelica. I wondered whether this girl might have been the origin of the teddy bear blanket Villegas had used to strangle Angelica, something that was likely handy in his vehicle. I also wondered whether Villegas had perhaps gifted the girl or her mother, or another one of his victims, a pair of little Mrs. Potts earrings. Unfortunately, we don't know. I, for one, absolutely believe that Villegas has additional victims we know nothing about. None of these child sexual abuse incidents were reported, and Angelica's family was very upset at this news, and the knowledge that if someone had spoken up about the abuse, it could have solved or even prevented her case. Angelica's sister Michaela said at the press conference, quote, "We are pleading with families. Don't let things slide. Notify someone because this could all have been prevented had someone spoken up. This person would have been behind jail had someone spoken up, but they didn't. So please speak up. Speak for yourself. Don't let harm continue affecting everyone." End quote. All of Villegas' known victims were Hispanic children. I asked Sergeant Lowry if he believed Villegas was a preferential offender, but we agreed it was more likely that he preyed on Hispanic children because those were the children he had access to. He was an opportunistic predator who left unreported trauma in his wake wherever he went. Okay, I know you're all wondering, since Villegas was sentenced to prison in California in 2002, why on earth his DNA was not in the state or federal DNA databases. California voters had passed Prop 69, requiring DNA submission by all convicted felons, even those convicted of nonviolent crimes. Villegas, convicted primarily of drug crimes, would have qualified. But this law passed in November 2004. Villegas was released and deported in October 2004. He missed the requirement by 1 month. Interestingly, a press release from the Tulare County Sheriff's Office stated that a 2010 study by the California Attorney General's Office found that the majority, 61%, of DNA samples that matched to a cold case were collected for non-violent felonies, like drug offenses and property crimes. Not all states require DNA samples from all convicted felons, but it sounds like maybe they should. Anyway, that's about the extent of what we know about Ramiro Villegas. Since his identification was released by the Tulare County Sheriff's Office, no new tips have come in revealing any additional crimes. But as I said, it's likely there are some and they weren't reported out of shame or fear or both. I asked Sergeant Lowry whether he believes Villegas was one of the men reported to be hanging outside the swap meet bathroom on the day that Angelica walked to the bathroom alone. According to Sergeant Lowry, Villegas did fit the description of one man reported as a latrine loiterer. He was a tall, very light-skinned Hispanic. Villegas was tall and had such a fair complexion that his nickname among his family members was the Russian. The Parabon phenotype had predicted that the suspect was of Hispanic origin with very light skin. Investigators also can only speculate about how Villegas won Angelica's trust. Sheriff Boudreau told me that he believes Villegas had seen Angelica before at other swap meets where she hung out at her mother's produce booth. We know he frequented swap meets, and perhaps he very subtly groomed her, waving at her, smiling, seeming friendly, maybe slipping her candy, their little secret. Perhaps on the day he took her, she recognized him and willingly accompanied the friendly man who spoke to her in her language and took advantage of her being alone. And of course, we know how he selected the culvert in which he dumped her little body after he raped her. He was a field worker who lived in that very area. It was likely the most easily accessible yet remote site that came to mind. Sheriff Boudreaux told me that when he learned Ramiro Villegas had been cremated in Mexico, he was only partially joking when he said he wanted those ashes to be sent to his county and locked up in a cell. He had told his investigators to spare no cost to find out who killed the little girl whose body he witnessed floating in that culvert decades ago. He was devastated to learn he would never put cuffs on the man who did that. The only saving grace to come from Villegas' death is that at least he can hurt no more children. If you or anyone you know are a victim of child sexual abuse, please report it to the appropriate authorities. Those predators don't stop, and you could save a life. After 28 years, Angelica Ramirez's case is resolved thanks to IGG. And if you're one of the bad guys, they are coming for you. Thank you so much to Tulare County Sheriff Mike Boudreaux and Detective Sergeant Joshua Lowry for speaking with me about this case. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to dnaidpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.